necessarily reflect actually the political economic agenda that the Muslim Brotherhood was putting forward when on the eve of coming to power, and actually when they did come to power. Because we know, in fact, that they had a more or less a fairly neoliberal political agenda in terms of promotion of big business, privatization, and signing up to IMF agreements and so on. Now, I want to step back and say, okay, how is Islamist politics on the eve of the uprisings? I want to trace, in a very schematic way, developments and changes, transformation in Islamist politics on the eve of the Arab uprising, and again, looking at the case of Egypt. So, to begin, by the end of 2010, I will start just by one of the main actors, Islamist actors on the scene in Egypt, and that's the Muslim Brotherhood. And as I said, I'm just giving you a very schematic overview of the changes and transformations that the Muslim Brothers had undergone. In simple terms and use and description put forward by Mona al-Ghobashi in an article in 2005, the Muslim Brothers had undergone a metamorphosis, a remake in their politics. For example, in 2007, they put out a political platform which they didn't adopt, but still it was an indication of the direction that they were taking, that showcased their democratic, quote-unquote democratic credentials. So part of that platform was equal treatment for minorities. In the case of Egypt, of course, would be the Copts, that they are full and equal citizens with Muslims, and also equal treatment of women with having full right in the electoral or in the political sphere, with full rights to be represented in all institutions of government. And in fact, there was talk, of course, of the possibility of either a woman or a Copt being allowed to run for president and accepted as a potential presidential figure or presidential win by either. As this, of course, was not adopted, but it shows that it reflects some of the kinds of debates and the direction that some of the members and leadership was considering. Also, through cross-ideological alliance with leftist parties, with liberal parties, in the oppositional politics, the anti-Mubarak politics that was quite, that grew in strength in the 2000s. Through these cross-ideological alliances also, they kind of garnered this image of being a democratic player or as possibly part of a transition to democracy. At least this is how scholars and those who research the Muslim Brotherhood have argued. Some of these developments were associated with the rise of what is known as the middle generation. So this is the middle generation is people like Isam al-Aryan and Khairat al-Shatir, who were in the 2000s, who would have been in their 40s, and so kind of not the old leadership that was influenced by the founders' thinking, and some of them influenced, let's say, by whether it is Hassan al-Banna or Sayyid Qutb, but these were activists that were formed politically through their work in the syndicates, professional syndicates, in the case of Isam al-Aryan, in the medical syndicate, or someone like Khairat al-Shatir, who was a businessman. So it kind of changed the profile of leadership, and it changed the profile of membership that was associated with this middle generation that was seen to be more accommodationist and more willing to be part of the political process, run in elections. Salwa Ismail was a member of parliament. I mean, he was imprisoned a number of times, but in fact, he was also a successful member of parliament. So this middle generation was also seen as part of the transformation and influencing this accommodation. On one hand, then, in the 2000s, the Muslim Brotherhood appeared to be successful, consolidating itself as an organization by running an election in 2005, in the national election 2005, for instance. They had done very well, becoming the main opposition to the Mubarak regime in parliament, winning, I think, 88 seats or something like that. But in fact, also the organization was challenged from within, particularly by the younger generation. I'm sure you're all familiar with this narrative that there were a younger generation, youth who were bloggers, for instance, who were questioning the leadership and who were questioning styles of action, the form of organization, which depended very much on obedience to the leaders, and who wanted, in fact, to see the organization willing to form a political party and to separate its religious proselytization activity from its political activity, and wanted to then greater political engagement on the part of the organization and clear political lines to be developed. Now, these youth were not really accommodated, and there were splits and there were dissension, and many left the organization. In fact, then this challenge was read by other scholars of the Muslim Brotherhood as a kind of a sign of the organization's old age. In fact, one of the closer observers of the Muslim Brotherhood, Khalil al-Inani, wrote a book in Arabic which would translate the Muslim Brotherhood battles old age. In predicting some kind of a decline because of its failure to accommodate, to integrate the younger generation, and to change in its old-style politics, which is based on traditional leadership, and based on a very hierarchical mode of organization and obedience to the leaders. So that was one facet of the organization. But there are other facets of the organization that we do not see much discussion of in scholarly work. And I want to draw on the work of an excellent PhD study on the organization's other facets of the organization that show us their presence at the grassroots and the kind of activism and modes of action and forms of organization that were also part of the Muslim Brotherhood. This work was done by Marie Van Etzel, and it was the subject of a PhD thesis at Sciences Po. And she actually did ethnographic work on who the members of the Muslim Brothers who get elected to parliament, how they get elected, what's their profile, and what is the social base of that. And the finding for what I think is interesting for us here is that we see actually in some areas, some neighborhoods of Cairo, in certain towns, outside even the capital and so on, that there was a different structure to the organization that integrated the clientelist politics of these that were very characteristic of the social sphere in Egypt under the Mubarak regime. Clientelist politics, which simply can be explained in terms of patronage networks run by figures of authority, figures of power, those who have capital, who have wealth, who have symbolic capital, who have actual capital and wealth, and who are able to command the constituency. The Muslim Brothers were able actually to integrate these clientelist networks in neighborhoods of Cairo, Alexandria, but also in rural towns and so on, integrate that into the organization. And it was through such networks that they were able to win elections. And of course, had there been free and fair elections, they would have done much better than the 88 seats that they got in 2005, for instance. So in fact, there was another structure or a different facet of the organization which reflected the everyday forms of organization in neighborhoods and in cities in Egypt. It was also, their presence was through social institutions, hospitals, clinics, not just mosques, but they were present in local government as well. But what they integrated are forms of organization that are typical and that the National Democratic Party, which is the party of Mubarak and which was the ruling party, also used. So there wasn't really much difference in terms of how they went about politics at the local level that the Muslim Brothers did from the National Democratic Party of Mubarak. This was a form of political organization which was, when we need to think about it, the social construction of politics in Egypt, which the Muslim Brothers followed, and so did the pro-Mubarak National Democratic Party follow as well, the party that was dissolved after the uprisings. Now, this is just one part of the political landscape, but also the political landscape or the landscape of Islamism was changing or transforming because other actors disappeared or kind of declined and new ones came onto the scene. So by the 1990s, we can speak of the decline of what was once talked about as militant Islamism, the kind of jihadist type Islamist actors whom we've seen from the late 70s and in the 80s, with organizations like the Jihad organization that was responsible for the assassination of President Sadat in 1981, or Al-Jama'ah Al-Islamiyya, the Islamic group, which was also in alliance with the Jihad. And these, in fact, I've talked about them earlier in really old work of mine as having anchored themselves in popular neighborhoods and informal neighborhoods of Cairo, also having been present in the Sa'id, other scholars have shown their presence in Upper Egypt and so on, and they had a very strong social grounding before being crushed by the very heavy hand of the security apparatus in Egypt, but also before losing some of their credibility because of the violence that they used. So these radical, militant Islamists kind of receded from the political landscape, but others, the so-called conservative, the Salafi type, were emerging. And by the 2000s, we see a kind of diversification and maybe fragmentation of the Islamist landscape. Here we see the emergence of the television preachers, satellite, Islamic satellite channels, the preachers who are either of the modernist kind, like some of you may be familiar, Amr Khalid and others, or the Salafi type that we see with a number of the Islamist channels from the 2000s on, and the just spread of Salafi preachers, cassettes, CDs, and that kind of thing. What another scholar talks about as the market for Islam. Patrick Hani's, the title of Patrick Hani's work. Now, this market for Islam was very much part of the changing socioeconomic and political context. The adoption of neoliberal policies, privatization of the economy, marketization of the social, and with that we see kind of a consumerist Islam, a market Islam that emerges through particular ideological discursive articulation, but through different practices as well. One feature of this, for instance, market Islam that we see particularly with the modernist preacher is the association of piety with prosperity. Being good and doing good. If you are good in distributing wealth and giving away, in doing charitable work, then you will get even wealthier and so on. This was part of the, and being a good Muslim was also affirmed by being rich and wealthy and so on. That was part of the discourse of someone like Amr Khalid, which led some to speak about neoliberal Islam. So that's another part of the transformation of the landscape. As I said, the militant Islamists receding and kind of Salafist, modernist preacher coming to the fore. Now, this may seem just a kind of a ideological articulations or discursive, but in fact this is tied also to practices. And here I will refer to another excellent PhD thesis, and I was involved in its supervision that was done by at SOAS by Sarah Sabri in development studies, who worked on Islamic NGOs that provide poor relief to the poor in informal neighborhoods of Cairo. And her findings are really relevant in this respect because it points out how organizations, NGOs that were giving aid to the poor in these neighborhoods tied aid with certain practices. For instance, the women attending, women from the households that were recipients of aid in kind or cash to attend religious lessons and to make their children go and attend lessons in religion. So that, of course, this was part of a forming of political subject, the forming of subjectivities. It's not just indoctrination, but it's about forming the good Muslim self. Whether successful or not, these kind of practices would have had a long-term effect. I mean, although Sabri's work, informants depict a very unflattering image of those NGOs and their personnel, the administrators, preachers that run them, but still that work was part of the transformative work that these new actors, the Salafis that have emerged on the scene, were doing. So today when we say, oh, the Salafis came out of nowhere, like all of a sudden we see all of these Salafi groups and organizations in Tunisia and in Egypt and beyond, people are surprised. Well, in fact, this is out of a long-term project and work that I have been doing for some time. The preachers, for instance, if you listen to many of the Salafi preachers, they talk about the educational work they've been doing since the 1990s. One of the very popular preachers discusses how in the 1990s, when he was going in the Delta governorates in Egypt to preach in mosques and meetings and so on, there were very few of them. And of course he uses a very superficial sign of how many of them there were when he says there were very few wearing the galabeya, the kind of the flowing robe, the three-quarter length flowing robe above the ankle with the trousers, and had the beard, and there were very few. And now this was